So earlier today, I was watching a panel discussion coming out of an initiative at Georgetown and Harvard, I believe. Uh, Interviews with survivors. These were female survivors. They've done an earlier, about a month ago. They interviewed a bunch of male survivors. The idea is to share survivors' voices, let people know what survivors are thinking, know what the experience of survivors is like. And I've I've participated in similar efforts to share survivors' voices. Uh, I'm going to go into too much of the details. I'm doing it anonymously. I don't care. I'm fine with people knowing, but it seems that people are a little concerned about knowing exactly which survivors are speaking, which goes to the problem that I want to address. And in this particular panel discussion that I saw today, and in the discussion of the male survivors that Georgetown hosted a month or so ago, I saw the same thing, which is the idea that a lot of what was said was true to a point, but certain things were left out. Certain things weren't discussed, and I have to wonder if that's because certain things couldn't be discussed. They feel like they can't be discussed, which is the problem. And that's consistent with what I've seen in similar efforts to share the voices of survivors, which is, well, I've used the term censorship. I don't know if it's necessarily censorship. Some of it might be good politics or just being political, which I get to a point. But that makes me suspicious. And it makes me wonder if part, if not all, of what's being done is a PR exercise, deliberately or not. Whether I and other survivors are being used, knowingly or not. And then there's also and in the not knowingly part, there's the problem of enabling, which I've talked about before, and which I discuss in my conversations, the talks I gave to Father Mark White's group. It's great that people want to hear about the voices of survivors, but the concern I have is that my concern is that it seems like it's only certain survivors with certain kinds of messages, and I don't hear other kinds of messages. And I don't hear discussions of certain topics, which is a problem because talk is cheap. Being from Missouri, there's this phrase that I never really understood, but now I get, in the light of being a survivor and dealing with all this stuff and some of the stuff that I'll talk about in a little bit, which is the idea that, that talk is cheap. If you want to impress me, you need to show me. My name is Chris O'Leary. I'm a survivor of this Catholic sex abuse crisis. In the late 70s and early 80s, first at the Church of the Immaculata, and then at my Jesuit high school, St. Louis University High School, I was sexually exploited, abused, assaulted, raped by a Catholic priest named Father Leroy Valentine. And then things happened at SLU in the locker room. And there was another incident in Haiti. I'm still kind of processing and trying to work my way through the high school stuff. And that's bad enough. But there's a bigger problem, which is that my abuse at grade school at Immaculata was witnessed, at least in part, by then Father and now Cardinal Timothy Dolan, the Archbishop of New York, who I went to for help in March 2002, just a couple of weeks after the original Spotlight reports. And then things got really bad when what I call the abuse of the abused began. You know, the Archdiocese of St. Louis in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch told lies about me, which led to my being shunned by my parish, by my family, by, you know, almost everybody that I know. I've also been part of a coordinated effort by the Archdiocese of St. Louis to terrorize me using the police, making false allegations. I've gone to the Missouri Attorneys General for help. Missouri Attorney General Josh Hawley, now Senator Josh Hawley, current Missouri Attorney General and Senate candidate Eric Schmidt, both of whom were completely useless in terms of the Catholic sex abuse crisis. Senator Hawley never did anything. I begged him for help, and his team never talked to me. Schmidt's team did talk to me, and which is actually worse than what Hawley did. I wish Schmidt's team had just ignored me because they gave me a false hope. Essentially what happened is that, you know, they kind of blew me off the first time. The second time, when I told them, metaphorically speaking, where the bodies are buried, they acted really interested. And then within a couple of weeks, Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt, a devout Catholic, killed the investigation, I assume to protect his church, the Catholic Church, the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And things aren't any better. I was shunned by Archbishop Rosansky, the new head of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, at the Easter Mass and the Easter Vigil of 2021, just a couple of months ago. So in case you think things are any better, they're not better. And part of the cause of the problem is some of what I saw in the Georgetown presentation, both today and especially the Georgetown Mail presentation, which is enabling of Pope Francis, where people talk glowingly about Pope Francis. And maybe they don't know, but the fact is that Pope Francis is not the friend of survivors that people think and that he would seem to be. As a result, I see a lot of what I consider to be premature forgiveness being given. All I care about is protecting children and making sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else, that what happened to me can't happen to anyone else, because I will be damned if I allow what happened to me to happen to anyone else. I mean that literally. So in terms of the panel discussions, the survivor voices, conversations, those kinds of things, I see lots of, the thing that concerned me is lots of pulled punches, what feels like a PR effort because of the censorship, because of what is not being discussed, things that I know and that I've experienced and that I've done everything in my power to get the word out about, that I know people know about, but people still won't talk about. And that censorship is starting to look like enabling. And if you listen to the talks I gave to Father Mark White's groups, you know, I spend a lot of time talking about enabling and enabling being the real problem. Catholics have a real problem with enabling. Catholics are enabling the Catholic Church, and that's why things are not getting significantly better. And that's the fact. The fact is that things are not getting significantly better for survivors or for children. Children in the Catholic Church face many of the same risks that they faced in the 70s. It's kind of stunning how little has changed. And I discuss all that in my podcast, Sacrificed, which you can find on Apple, Google, you know, all the main podcast things. Just search for Chris O'Leary Sacrificed. But so this enabling that I'm seeing, I fear reflects a form of groupthink, where the unspoken message, the unspoken goal is to first and foremost protect the church. And that includes certain bishops, certain powerful bishops, people like Timothy Cardinal Dolan, the Archbishop of New York, the man who saw, at least in part, what was being done to me by Father Leroy Valentine, what was being done to others upstairs in the rectory, on the weekends in the rectory by Father Leroy Valentine, and who turned a blind eye to it. I absolutely believe that then Father, now Cardinal Timothy Dolan, established himself as a reliable member of the Catholic Church, as a guy who could be counted on by what he did at Immaculata and what he didn't do at Immaculata. That was in the late 70s. What he then did in 2002, March, when I and at least two other guys came to him for help with allegations against Father Leroy Valentine. Cardinal Dolan established himself as a reliable member of the hierarchy by how he handled the Father Leroy Valentine situation, which I believe earned Dolan Milwaukee. And based on how Dolan handled St. Louis and Milwaukee, Dolan then earned New York. So the problem that I'm seeing in the Georgetown panel discussion, that I'm seeing in the survivor voices, and I'm seeing coming out of other survivors, quote unquote, survivor organizations, is efforts to put forth the right kinds of survivors and stories, people from the right kinds of dioceses, which ignores certain, and I would say those right kinds of survivors and stories represent the minority. There are a small number of dioceses and archdioceses that are doing things right, that are doing things well, that are helping survivors, that are doing the right thing. But in my opinion, and in my experience being at the Archdiocese of St. Louis, it would not surprise me if the vast majority of dioceses within the Archdiocese of St. Louis are doing little to nothing at best to help survivors, which I feel is a problem. And it's a problem that's not being addressed by these panel discussions. It's not being addressed by these efforts to collect survivor voices. And the worst part is that I see censorship. When I try to raise issues, I see censorship. I see names being redacted. I see events being redacted. I see flaws, false promises being redacted from statements that I make, which is problematic. And then in other cases on these panel discussions, well, I've never been invited to a panel discussion. I am participating in the Xavier Fordham moral injury survey, but nobody wants to talk to me. Nobody wants to put me on a panel. I think because they're afraid that I will tell my story. And I don't know the nature of this censorship. If it could be a false, toxic kind of positivity, where people only want to tell positive stuff, and they, maybe I'm too negative, or they think I'm too negative. I don't think I'm too negative, because I'm just telling the truth. I'm just telling the story. I don't think reality can be positive or negative. Reality is just reality. But the bigger concern is enabling, where people are trying to protect the church. And in protecting the church, and there's those efforts to protect the church, they're putting children at risk. And that, for me, is unacceptable. So what am I referring to? I'm referring to the avoidance of certain topics, of certain survivors, perhaps certain dioceses like the Archdiocese of St. Louis, dioceses that are failing survivors. I see Minneapolis come up a lot. I see lots of, LA, New York, New Jersey. Those dioceses come up, but what about St. Louis? Nobody ever talks about St. Louis. What's going on in St. Louis? What's going on in the Carolinas? What's going on in Nebraska? Things are not all hunky-dory. There's more to life. There's more to the world. There's more to the Catholic Church than LA and New York and Chicago. What about St. Louis? What about Lincoln? If you dug into what's going on in those dioceses, if you talk to survivors from those dioceses, you will find things are not perfect. Things are not as they seem. And the problem is that it seems like people don't want to talk to people they don't want to talk to people like me from those dioceses that are failing survivors because of the problem of the abuse of the abused, because of the horror stories that I can tell. Specifically, I don't see, and in the panel discussion today, I don't see a discussion of the Georgetown stuff. I've never seen any discussion of the abuse of the abused. What is done to survivors when they try to get help? Not just the failure to help them, the adversarial relationships, the lawyers, and all that, but the efforts to destroy survivors, the efforts to discredit survivors. What's been done to me that's led to my being shunned by my parish, my family, all that. I also don't see, and this is a major point, this is a huge point for me, I don't see any discussion of Vos Estis Lux Mundi. That's a huge point that I'll get to in a little bit, but nobody's talking about Vos Estis Lux Mundi. And I don't see a significant discussion of the different treatment by different dioceses. Yeah, it's great that St. Paul, Minneapolis is helping survivors, but what about St. Louis? What's happening to survivors in St. Louis and Lincoln and the Carolinas and all the other places in Knoxville? There's differential treatment by different dioceses. Different dioceses and different bishops are treating survivors differently, and I don't see that acknowledged or even discussed. And too much of what's going on, there's this perception that the Pope is under attack, and I get that to a degree. EWTN is, they're crazy people. Fact is that Jesus Christ was kind of a lib. So when Pope Francis says things that seem kind of liberal, that, and I'm a fairly conservative person, but the fact is that Jesus Christ was a lib. So when Pope Francis says things that seem kind of liberal, I understand that. I get that. He's echoing Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was a pretty liberal person, free healthcare and all that. I don't have any problem with Pope Francis in terms of what he says. I think what he's saying in terms of the message he's conveying is consistent with the example set by Jesus Christ. The problem with Pope Francis, where he's falling short, is Vos Estis Lux Mundi. The fact is that Vos Estis Lux Mundi is a sham, a fraud, a cruel taunt directed at survivors. It's merely a PR exercise because Pope Francis is failing to enforce Vos Estis Lux Mundi. I've sent 10 letters to the Vatican to the Pope, including one delivered by Cardinal Sean O'Malley, hand-delivered to the Pope, placed on the Pope's desk by Cardinal Sean O'Malley. I have a letter from Cardinal Sean O'Malley promising that he was going to do that. It was 2 years ago. Nothing's happened. I've heard nothing from the Vatican. Nobody's doing anything to ensure that the Archdiocese of St. Louis lives up to the promises made by the Pope in Vos Estis Lux Mundi, specifically Article 5 of Vos Estis Lux Mundi, which contains basically a survivor's Bill of Rights that lays out what the Catholic Church will and will not do for and to survivors. The Archdiocese of St. Louis is in direct, open violation of Vos Estis Lux Mundi, and neither the Pope nor the Vatican or anyone in Rome seems to care. Bishops are ignoring Vos Estis Lux Mundi. At a minimum, the archbishops of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, Archbishop Carlson, now Archbishop Rosansky, they're ignoring Vos Estis Lux Mundi. They're in open defiance of Vos Estis Lux Mundi, and nobody cares. I've never heard anyone in any panel discussion discuss Vos Estis. And I worry that there's a level of enabling there from the moderators of those panels and those discussions of survivors. And the reason why Vos Estis is a big deal for me, that point was made just this weekend. As I say, Vos Estis Lux Mundi contains a Bill of Rights for survivors. That's Article 5 of Vos Estis. The Archdiocese of St. Louis is in violation of Article 5 of Vos Estis Lux Mundi. in terms of how it's treating me, what it's doing to me, how it's smearing me, how it's attacking me, how it's smearing me in the press, how it's sicking the police on me. And that's a problem because, just more fundamentally because of my relationship with not just my parish, but my kids. My older son and his wife, my daughter-in-law, they're pregnant, due middle of December. And on Saturday, they had a baby shower for her. And I wasn't invited. Didn't expect to be, it's a chick thing. I didn't want to be invited to that. Too much estrogen. But what that meant is that both of my daughters were in town from Kansas City. And I have, because of what the Catholic Church has done and said to or about me, including in the paper, my daughters won't speak to me. I haven't spoken to my daughters in coming up on 2 years because of my decision to speak out against my treatment by the Catholic Church and what the Catholic Church is doing to survivors and to children and to others. They were in town. My daughters were in town at my ex-wife's house, just a mile from here, and they didn't stop by to say hi. Which kills me. And what I see in Vos Estis Lux Mundi is a chance to fix that problem. Vos Estis Lux Mundi, to me, represents a chance to fix that problem, because if Pope Francis forced the Archdiocese of St. Louis to follow the tenets of Vos Estis, the Archdiocese of St. Louis would have to change how it treats me, which hopefully would mean that people would start talking to me again, people in my parish and my kids. And screw my parish, whatever. I would like my kids to talk to me. But the problem with Vos Estis is that there's an expiration date. June 2022, less than a year from now, Vos Estis expires. So what I hear in my head is a ticking clock. Vos Estis is my best chance to reconnect with my kids, to force the Archdiocese of St. Louis to take back what it said about me publicly in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, to force the Archdiocese of St. Louis to help me. And as each day passes and Pope Francis refuses to enforce Vos Estis Lux Mundi, the chance that I will be able to reconnect with my kids grows smaller and smaller. So the Pope Francis' failure to enforce Vos Estis is a big personal deal for me. It affects me every day. It affected me this weekend. I'm still devastated from this weekend, So let's talk about collaborators, which is a term that I take from World War II, generally the French who collaborated with the Nazis. And some will say that that's over the top, but this is the Catholic Holocaust, and there's a lot of Nazi-esque behavior coming out of the hierarchy in terms of the treatment of survivors. And I find it's an offense that the Catholic Church embraces the German Nazi resistors when the Catholic Church does what it does to survivors. The Catholic Church is following the example of the Nazi regime in terms of its treatment of people. It's incredibly offensive that the Catholic Church would embrace the Nazi resistors, Sophie Scholl, the White Rose, Bonhoeffer, because the Catholic Church is anything but. The Catholic Church is following the example of the Nazis, not the resistors of the Nazis. And that's facilitated by these enablers, the collaborators, people who think that what they need to do, what needs to be done, is that they need to protect the church, whose first goal, first and foremost, is to protect the church. I quoted Gloria Gaynor to a fellow survivor the other day. I will survive. The problem is that while that's a great mantra, it's been distorted by too many Catholics who are singing that the church must survive. And that means by any means. Anything possible and necessary must be done to protect the church, which I think evidences a profound lack of faith. God and Jesus Christ will protect the church if the church acts in a way that is deserving of its and his protection. I hear the phrase, Peter is my rock, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. I think people who quote that line as evidence of the need to protect the church are showing a profound lack of faith. The phrase, the gates of hell will not prevail, well, the word prevail means that there's going to be a battle, which means that the Catholic Church has to be fought for. And the way you fight for the Catholic Church is by battling evil, not by collaborating with or enabling evil. The gates of hell will not prevail if Catholics do the right thing and fight for what is right, not what is evil, which means not enabling, which means not protecting the Pope from reasonable criticisms. More about that in a little bit. As I said, I took a survey about moral injury. I don't really care about moral injury. It's not a big deal to me. What I care about, this experience has made me a stronger Christian. It's brought me closer in line with Jesus Christ. What I care about is protecting children and solving the systemic problems. And that's one other thing I don't see discussed in these panel discussions, in the Georgetown panel discussion from today, is the systemic problem. The problem of the bishops, like Cardinal Dolan, who are abuse profiteers, who earned their station from their willingness to turn a blind eye to the sexual abuse of children like me. That is a systemic problem that I don't see being discussed in these panel discussions, in these survivor voices conversations. There's too much enabling going on. There's too many unaskable questions that may not be obvious to a lay Catholic, but are all too obvious to a survivor. So in terms of that, what needs to be discussed? And to be clear, I don't see this, some may see this as being negative. I see it as being blunt, as not enabling, as refusing to enable the Catholic Church. If you love someone, you don't enable them. You tell them the truth. You tell them what they're doing that is wrong and it is problematic, and why, and what they need to be doing better. So that's my view of what I'm doing. I'm barely a Catholic. I have my pinky toe left in the Catholic Church. I'm almost completely out, in large part because the Catholic Church has abandoned me, shunned me, cast me out. But in that, I feel a lot of solidarity with Jesus Christ. So in a lot of ways, it's made me a stronger Christian. But it's that dichotomy of what's Catholic versus what's Christian that's a problem and is the problem. I don't want to get into the whole Protestant criticism of Catholicism, but this is kind of my own criticism of Catholicism. There are lots of things that are Catholic that are not Christian. What's being done to me may be Catholic, but it's not Christian. And in saying that, that's harsh, it's blasphemy, that's heresy. I don't care. I refuse to enable. I'm going to tell it like it is. And in that, I believe that I'm following the example of Jesus Christ, who died for us and for me. So what needs to be discussed? The fact is, first and foremost, progress is spotty. Yes, things seem to be okay and better in LA, Chicago, New York, New Jersey. But what about St. Louis? And there's a real problem where there's an attitude of things are not my problem. I've talked to people in Chicago, I've talked to people in LA, trying to alert them in New York, trying to alert them to the problems in St. Louis, and nobody cares. The attitude is, that's not my problem. People care about their own diocese, their own archdiocese, and that's it. If it's not happening in their archdiocese, they really don't care. That not my problem attitude is a problem. And I understand how the power structure works. Ultimately, bishops and archbishops report only to the Pope. But there is this concept of fraternal correction. Bishops, at a minimum, the good bishops, assuming there are any, should be leaning on their fellow bishops, compelling them to do the right thing, letting them know that they're doing the wrong thing, refusing to enable them. They should also be talking to the Pope, letting them know of the problems. That's just basic, that's just how things, that's how good things are accomplished and how evil is battled. And that's not what's happening. You've got too much cowardice, too much enabling. People are keeping their heads down and their mouths shut, and that's a problem. What needs to be discussed? The abuse of the abused needs to be discussed. What needs to be discussed is what is done to survivors who refuse to shut up, who, like me, press our diocese and archdiocese for help. We're brutalized, we're terrorized, we're tormented by the Catholic Church, by our church. The original Church of Jesus Christ is terrorizing and tormenting me. That doesn't seem very consistent with that whole Jesus guy. What needs to be discussed is Vos Estis and Pope Francis' refusal to enforce it. You're not helping or protecting the church or the Pope by refusing to discuss the Pope's refusal to enforce Vos Estis. You are enabling him. You are doing the work of Satan, not Jesus Christ, by refusing to discuss the Pope's failures. What needs to be discussed is the realities of therapy. It's simply inappropriate for a Catholic, a Remainer Catholic, much less a devout Catholic, to treat a Catholic survivor. That's inappropriate. Really, that should be rolled up to the APA level and ruled inappropriate. If Catholics need help, they should be getting help from Lutherans and Jews. If Jews need help, they should be getting help from Catholics and Lutherans. Catholics should not be giving therapy or getting therapy from Catholics. Jews should not be getting therapy from Jews. I've been there. I've done that. It doesn't work. The loyalties, especially of a devout person, of a person who wants to believe, the loyalties, they come through, and what's the result is gaslighting. I was gaslighted by a therapist who was very well-intentioned, a very nice person, but the fact was she ended up gaslighting me because she couldn't believe that what I was saying about Archbishop Carlson, Cardinal Dolan. A survivor should not be subjected to gaslighting in the course of therapy, which is really why survivors need to be given money and cut loose from their church. They need to be given money and should be allowed to take that money to where the help is available. A Catholic should be able to go to a Jew or a Lutheran or an atheist or whatever. Any effort to control that is abusive and problematic and should be illegal, if not at least inappropriate, according to the APA, the American Psychological Association. What's the problem? Abusers are still being ordained. As I discuss in my podcast, Sacrifice, the most recent episode, which I've left up deliberately because it's so horrible, in Knoxville, Tennessee, Bishop Sticca keeps trying to ordain guys who've been thrown out of multiple seminaries for abuse. There's this guy who I believe is in St. Louis. He's basically being hidden in St. Louis, who's been thrown out of multiple seminaries, Chicago, Indiana, I believe, who's been accused of terrible things, and who Bishop Rick Sticca, the Archbishop of Knoxville, Tennessee, is protecting. and is dead set on ordaining. That's a huge problem. It's literally insane that that's still a problem, that that's still a fact, that that's still a possibility, but yet it is. Bishop Rick Sticka, the Archbishop or the Bishop of Knoxville, Tennessee, is desperate, dead set on ordaining a known abuser, a man who's been thrown out of multiple seminaries for sexual harassment, abuse. You know, I understand, you know, 1 strike and you're not out, 2 strikes and you're not out, but good Lord, 3 strikes and you're out. You got to be out. The fact that isn't the case shows how little has changed in the Catholic Church. It's an unacceptable problem, and people refuse, very few people refuse to discuss, or very few people will discuss it. People generally refuse to discuss it. Other problems that need to be discussed, again, how spotty the progress is. Sure things are great in LA, New York, New Jersey, Chicago. Still skeptical about that. Minneapolis, I'd like to talk to some survivors to make sure that's actually the case and not just PR. But what about St. Louis? What about survivors in St. Louis? I could tell you, I could talk for 2 hours about what I've endured. Nobody wants to talk to me. Nobody will allow me to mention St. Louis. No panel discussions want to talk about it. Nobody wants to talk about the abuse of the abused. And in that respect, you have this conversation about the Eucharistic revival and how the Eucharistic revival is the solution to the problem of people leaving the church, which, you know, people leaving the Catholic Church are making a completely rational decision. What happened was the Catholic Holocaust. And the worst part is that the Catholic Holocaust is still going on. There was no denazification. There was no Vergangenheitsbewältigung. The Catholic Holocaust is still going on because the hierarchy was not cleaned up. Bishops like Bishop Rick Sticka of Knoxville, Tennessee, continue to be hell-bent on ordaining known abusers. I don't know why. I assume so he can get his red hat. That's unacceptable. And lay Catholics, young Catholics see that and they're like, screw that. I don't want to be a part of that. They see the indifference, they see the hypocrisy, and they want out. And very rationally, they want out. Like I said, I've got a pinky toe in. There are some things about the Catholic Church that I like and love. It's not just the rituals, although the rituals were cool. It comes down to the reverence for Mary and women and the saints. You know, Saint Mary MacKillop she was a badass, and I follow her example. I think about her all the time. Ask for her intercession. As for Mary, I had an interesting experience just right over there. I felt like a message was sent to me by Mary. I'll discuss it some other time. It's a pretty powerful story, one I'm still trying to process, and it's still hitting me. But, you know, if you want to save the Catholic Church, if you think the Catholic Church deserves saving, which I do, it's the indifference, stupid. It's the hypocrisy, stupid. Deal with the indifference, deal with the hypocrisy, then you will save the Catholic Church. But it's only by dealing with the indifference and the hypocrisy that the Catholic Church will justify itself sufficiently to deserve saving. At this point, the Catholic Church does not deserve saving. And that's heresy and blasphemy. I don't care. It's just, that's the truth. I see a lot of people talk about healing. I don't care about healing. I care about protecting children. You want healing? I don't care about healing. I want the Catholic Church to stop ordaining known abusers. I want bishops who would ordain a known abuser to be held accountable and removed from a position of authority over priests. You've got priests being terrorized in Knoxville, Tennessee for resisting what Bishop Sticka is doing. You've got Cardinal Dolan, who was able to turn a blind eye to the sexual abuse of me and countless others at Immaculata by Father Leroy Valentine. Dolan has 1,000 priests under him. God only knows what Dolan is turning a blind eye to. That's unacceptable. The bishops have to be held accountable. People have to stop enabling the Catholic Church and its bishops and its leaders and the Pope. Pope Francis isn't enforcing Vos Estis Lux Mundi. That's a fact. Somebody needs to call him out on it. Somebody needs to start discussing the problem. Nobody will discuss the problem. And that's a problem of the Catholic press. And I know there are writers who want to write on that problem, who've approached me about writing that problem, but they can't get the editors to authorize the articles. Nobody's doing the Vos Estis 1 year later, Vos Estis 2 years later. There are writers who want to write that article who are being shot down by editors or management or both. And these included the same publications that broke the original stories about the sex abuse crisis. They are now killing the stories about the Pope's refusal to enforce Vos Estis. That's not progress. That doesn't mean the kids are safer. That's enabling. That means that kids are at risk. That is a huge problem that is yet to be solved. Censorship is bad. Why are you trying to protect bad behavior? That doesn't make any sense. Talk is cheap. Sure, the Pope passed Vos Estis. He enacted Vos Estis. He signed Vos Estis, but he refuses to enforce Vos Estis. If you want to help the Catholic Church, you need to stop enabling. That includes the Pope. You have to start holding people accountable. That includes the Pope. That includes the bishops. Bishop Sean O'Malley, the Archbishop of Boston, possible future Pope, probably the most likely American Pope. Sure, he wrote me this flowery letter about Vos Estis and how important survivors are. Well, but it's been 2 years and I haven't heard anything in terms of the Catholic Church or the Pope or Rome or the Vatican enforcing Vos Estis. Talk is cheap. Show me, Cardinal Sean. When is Cardinal Dolan going to be held accountable for what happened at Immaculata, what he did and did not do in the face of my and our abuse by Father Leroy Valentine? When's that going to happen? When is Bishop Rick Sticca of Knoxville going to be held accountable for desperately, repeatedly trying to ordain a known abuser who's been thrown out of multiple seminaries for accusations and who is now being hidden in St. Louis by the Archdiocese of St. Louis? Where's the accountability for Archbishop Rosansky, who turned his back to me, who ignored me, who shunned me at the Easter Vigil in 2021 March, and who now is harboring a known abuser at St. Louis University? What exactly has changed if all that can be going on still? I don't see any difference from the 70s. I just see better PR. I see people talking about things, but they're not talking about everything. There are problems. The Catholic Church is very sick. They've traced the call, and Satan is calling from inside the Catholic Church. And that's scary, and that's terrifying, and I know people don't want to hear it, but the fact is that it's true. Look at the behaviors. Look at what is being done and what is not being done. Who is desperately being ignored and retained, and what isn't being enforced. And I know that's scary and it's intimidating, but this is the stuff that saints are made of. If Jesus Christ can do what he did, entering Jerusalem to a certain and known fate, then you and I and we can do this.